Welcome to the Lawyering Peace interview series, where we explore the intricacies of diplomacy and law in peace processes and conflict stabilization. Join us as we dive into discussions with individuals who have played key roles as diplomats, negotiators, mediators, lawyers in negotiating and sustaining peace. I'm your host, Dr. Paul Williams, the founder of the Public International Law and Policy Group, and the Rebecca Grazier Professor of Law and International Relations at American University. In this interview, I am joined by Ambassador Robert Ford. Robert, welcome. I'm so excited to have you joining us today.
My pleasure to be with you, Paul.
Well, as most of our listeners already know, Ambassador Ford is the former political counselor and deputy chief of mission for the United States Embassy in Iraq from 2004 and intermittently all the way through 2010. He was also the ambassador to Syria, in which role he was the State Department lead on the Syrian peace process, developing policies and strategies with the European and Middle Eastern allies in support of our efforts to resolve the Syrian conflict. And as we mentioned, he was the deputy U.S. ambassador to Iraq, and he was also the ambassador to Algeria. Now, in today's conversation, we're going to focus both on Ambassador Ford's role in Iraq, helping to engage in electoral process design, supporting the Iraqi government on their constitutional negotiations and design, and then on coalition management and assistance with designing and implementing governance structures in order to secure peace. So Ambassador Ford, give us a little context of your multi-dimensional role in Iraq, beginning in 2004 and taking us all the way through 2010.
My principal work in Iraq was to lead the American Embassy's political affairs office. It was a big office. We had about 25 American diplomats. That group alone was as big as the size of a diplomatic presence in a lot of countries, an entire embassy by themselves. Our role essentially was to move forward on the ground Washington's policy of building a new and strong Iraqi government that would be able to take over eventually the security functions performed by the American military so that the American military could withdraw from Iraq.
So, Robert, let's turn to 2004, where you were playing a role in advising the Iraqi party's constituencies on designing an electoral law. And I'm curious if you could talk about that experience, because so many of our guests that I've interviewed, and as well as our listeners, are involved in states that make a transition from an authoritarian to a democratic system of government. Setting up elections is one of the first things they want to do and one of the most complicated to understand and to do properly. How did you work that situation with the Iraqis?
In 2004, the United Nations had the lead on implementing the elections, and the United Nations largely ran the elections, which were held in January of 2005. The election process was determined by the United Nations. The Iraqis basically did what the United Nations expert team told them to do. There was a discussion in Washington about what kind of representation would be best for American interests in terms of the Iraqi election, whether it should be a single national election with candidates just drawn from electoral lists and awarded seats based on national election returns, or whether it should be a district by district system. Probably the selection of a national district, one single district, ended up helping Shia Islamists at the expense of Kurdish and Sunni politicians. But the United Nations wanted to go that way because the administration, and remember, it was a war zone at the time, the administration would have been much simpler and there were no electoral districts drawn. So they would have had to draw the electoral districts, get the Iraqis to sign off on individual electional districts. Was this village in District A or was that village in District B? It would have been a challenge, especially because it had never been done before. So the UN took the short road out and just had a single district. The American role in that was essentially to keep the Iraqis on board. President George W. Bush insisted that the elections occur on schedule in January 2005. We then had two key things we were responsible for in the political office of the American Embassy. First, almost immediately, a number of Sunni Arab parties said they would boycott the election because of security and because of this single national district that I talked about. They understood it would hurt them and help their opponents, the Shia Islamists. And so we spent a substantial amount of time lobbying groups like the Iraqi Muslim Brotherhood, which was called the Iraqi Islamic Party, as well as Sunni Arab secular politicians. And they had a few very loose coalitions that we sat with. In the end, the boycott was widespread. They ignored American advice. And in the parliament that was elected, there was a very, very small Sunni Arab representation in the parliament, which caused problems later on with the drafting of the Constitution. The second thing which the political office of the American Embassy was doing was liaising between the United Nations election team and the big gorilla in the American government, which was the American military. The American military by this time in late 2004 had about 130, 140,000 soldiers on the ground. And I don't think listeners, if you haven't worked with the U.S. military, it's very difficult to understand the enormous resources available to the American military, which no other U.S. government entity, not the State Department, not the Treasury Department, not the Agriculture Department, no one has these kinds of resources. And the U.S. military's sole function for these elections was to provide security as best they could. They were having enormous problems in places like Anbar in Western Iraq, for example. The U.S. military tended to want to sort of get into operational details, which the United Nations team thought was not the purview of the U.S. Military, and that the U.S. military needed to stay out. And so we spent a fair amount of time going back and forth, insisting that the U.S. military work on security operations, but that it not go beyond that scope. Just to give listeners an example of what I'm talking about, there was a question, for example, of how ballot boxes, after the voting stopped and with the ballots in them, how those ballots would be counted and who would be present at the counting, and then how would they be transported to larger intermediate level collection centers should they be needed for subsequent vote count verifications. The U.S. military, they had the resources, they had the trucks, they had the soldiers, they had the armed guys. They were prepared to do all of that. And the United Nations was very concerned about the legitimacy, especially if the Americans had too prominent a role. And so there was a constant negotiation going back and forth about how much the American military would do versus civilians from the United Nations.
So you essentially had a negotiation between State Department, Department of Defense, and the United Nations,
Yep,
all about the
exactly.
Iraq electoral process.
Exactly. And I mean, I as I look back on it now, 20 years later, I almost have to laugh because for every one American diplomat or for every one United Nations election team expert, we would be dealing with 20 to 30 U.S. military officers and enlisted people, very well intentioned. Please understand, they were very well intentioned, but they had a mission, and they're not used to people compromising their actions to implement the mission.
So, Robert, what were maybe one or two takeaway lessons from your experience on the elections, working with the Iraqis? In that case, it was a new thing, both the electoral law, the electoral system, voting, the United Nations, which has a long history of post-conflict stabilization and knows what it wants to do. Whether it works or not, it doesn't really seem to matter, but it knows what it wants to do in terms of its strategy. And the US military, which is the big dog or the big gorilla in any post-conflict environment involving the American deployment of forces. What were some of the takeaways of how to diplomatically manage that?
The first thing I would say, and it's the lesson that I took forward out of Iraq when I went to Syria, is that elections don't fix essential political disagreements. Um, and in fact, hastily organized elections or elections where there isn't an accompanying set of additional measures to address political differences can actually aggravate the situation. We, the American Embassy in the political office, told Washington in November that Sunni Arabs would not vote, that they were going to boycott and we were going to get a skewed parliament. Washington understood the implications and they actually tried to propose some ideas to get them to vote. But the overall lesson was that by driving forward in January 2005, we got a skewed parliament that made things worse. So be very careful with elections. Timing of elections and how they're held are really important. And if you have a major faction that boycotts, you're setting yourself up for difficulties later. On a more technical level, I think it's really important early on for there to be an understanding, especially when dealing with the US military, about processes, which is to say, when are decisions made and who's involved in the making of those decisions? And if there are appeals to be made, how is that done too? So that it's clear from the beginning when there are disputes, how those disputes will be resolved and who will be involved. Related to that, of course, is a sort of an agreement about scope of work, which is to say, what will the US military do? And remember, they have resources way beyond what civilian agencies, either multinational like the United Nations or the US government, they have resources way beyond what the civilians have with whom they're working. And so they will naturally offer to do a great many things which might look attractive in the immediate situation, but which again can taint legitimacy or buy-in as you go down the road. Third thing I would say is the need to share information both within US government structures. I cannot tell you how many times we were surprised when the US military announced something and we were scrambling trying to figure out what did they just say and why did they say it and who said it exactly, who approved it. In fact, it's back to the process issue. And also the need to stay tightly linked with the United Nations team in Iraq because they were the actual implementers on the ground. We were supposed to be facilitating. We were lucky that in the 2004 run-up to the January 2005 elections, the United Nations team was relatively open with us. They absolutely jealously guarded their decision-making authority, but they were willing to discuss with us what they were doing and why they were doing it. And we frequently had to go to Iraqi politicians, or, for example, the interim Iraqi Prime Minister, Ayad Alawi, to explain why the Americans thought what the United Nations was doing was the right thing to do, and to press Dr. Ayad on agreeing with the process the United Nations laid out.
So do tell us a little bit about the ideas for overcoming the Sunni boycott, because it's one of the common tactics in a post-conflict election. One of the parties will perceive that they're not going to do well, and they immediately go with the boycott. So what are some good ideas and what are some kind of not so good ideas that were floated to get the Sunnis to participate in the elections?
Uh, we had a late night secure video conference in late November of 2004 between State Department and national security staffers, and the American Embassy political office, my team, me and my team. The video conference started at about midnight our time in Baghdad, which is routine because it's late afternoon in Washington. It's a good time in Washington to do video conferences before the end of the day. Not a great time for us, midnight. But anyway, the problem was the boycott, and we had sat for many, many, many meetings with Sunni politicians and Sunni activists, Sunni Arab activists in Baghdad, in Western Iraq, Anbar province, up in Mosul, in Northwest Iraq. And they were genuinely concerned about terrorism. And at this point, the Iraqi armed resistance to the Americans had really taken off. And there was a fair amount of killing, both attacks on American soldiers, but also attacks by Iraqis against other Iraqis who were considered to be pro-American or supporting the interim government of Dr. Ayad Alawi. And so there was genuine fear among Sunni Arab politicians that if they participated, they could well get assassinated, or their political party offices could be bombed. That happened several times with the Iraqi Muslim Brotherhood Party. They were literally attacked and people killed by harder line Sunni Arab rejectionists, sometimes inspired by the Ba'ath Party, sometimes inspired by what became Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And despite our assurances that the U.S. military would do all it could for security, they weren't buying into it because what they saw on the ground was that the Americans were not taking care of it. The American military was not. So Washington came up with some ideas to encourage Sunni Arab voters to go to ignore the threats, the death threats. People going to vote would be killed. Ignore those threats and go vote. And the first idea they proposed was that people vote by cell phone. And at about, I don't know, 12:15 in the morning or 12:30 in the morning, the national security staff said, well, we could have people vote by cell phone. And I asked them, well, how does that work? This is in November 2004. And they said, well, people would dial in to a number and they would press, 1 for the Iraqi Islamic Party and press 2 for the National Bloc and press 3. There were 146 parties running in this one national district. So how people would even know which number to press was going to be a challenge. Washington said, "Oh, well, we can, flood the air zones with ads and flyers and banners." And I asked them when they said that. I said, "Well, does anybody in the United States vote this way? Like, do they do this in California?" And I didn't know it, and they said, "No, this has never been done anywhere." And I said, "Well, okay, so we're going to go to Iraq in the middle of a war zone, and we're going to tell people this is how they're going to vote." I said, that's not how they're looking at a vote. To them, a vote is you have a piece of paper, you mark it, and you drop it in a ballot box. And anything else isn't going to look very legitimate, especially if it isn't done anywhere. I said, if it was done maybe in some European democracy or in America, we could point to that. But if it's never been done before, it's going to look really suspicious, like the Americans have come up with this way to rig the vote. So that we shot down. Then the second idea, they said, well, they could vote by computer. And I said, well, vote by computer? How would that work? And they said, well, people would get on their computers and log on to the election website and type in their voter identification number, which the UN could assign, and then just vote electronically, press here for party number 1 and press there for party number 2 and press there for party number 146. And I said, interesting. I said, is anybody doing that anywhere in the world? And they said, no, not that we know of. It would be the first time. And I said, okay, well, I said, I like that idea. And I think Iraqis would like it a little better than the cell phone idea. But I said, there's a really crippling problem with this. And they said, what's that? And I said, there is no electricity most of the day in most of the places that are most affected by the boycott. There's simply not any electricity, or maybe an hour a day. That's it. And that kind of unhappy reality closed the meeting at about, I don't know, 12:30, 12:45 in the morning. And I left the secure video conference room deep in the bowels of the Iraqi presidential palace where the embassy was operating, went back to my office to get my stuff and go home and try to get some sleep. And the phone rang, and it was a colleague from the State Department in Washington who later went on to be an ambassador. And he said to me, Robert, you were extremely unhelpful in that video conference. People worked hard on those ideas, and you just shot them all down. And so thus duly chastened, I went home and started again the next day.
Working hard on an idea does not make it a good idea.
Yeah, that goes without saying. Yeah.
Well,
So it was a real problem because in the Constitution drafting committee, consistently there were not enough Sunni Arab voices at the table to promote their views of, in particular, how a federal Iraq should operate. In general, Sunni Arabs at this time, 2004, 2005, 2006, were very leery of a federal Iraq where Iraq's provinces would have greater authority. Of course, it had never been done during Saddam Hussein's Iraq or the Ba'ath Party's experience in Iraq and Syria and elsewhere. Arab nationalism had always called for powerful central governments to administer the entire country without much input at the local level, from the local level. And the Kurdish elements and the Shia elements, after the bitter experience of Saddam Hussein, did not want a powerful central government. And that came to a fore in the constitution negotiations, but it was a real problem.
Robert, let's talk about the 2005 constitutional negotiations for a little bit, because as you mentioned, it was, it's a transition from an authoritarian to democracy, from a unitary state with, thinking a federal, and not only a federal, but an asymmetric federal, with the Kurds being able to have three provinces joined together in one region, and then the region would have certain rights and privileges. In other regions, other provinces could join together in a region, but that didn't happen. And usually when we work with our clients, they look to the left and to the right in the region. Okay, what are some other examples of democracies that have transitioned out from authoritarian regimes? What are some similar state structures? You could look far and wide in the region and not come up with any examples. How did you socialize your Iraqi counterparts to these notions of federalism, devolution of power, asymmetric relationships?
The Kurds from the beginning had a game plan, and they participated enthusiastically in this January 2005 election that I was talking about. So they had a strong presence in the parliament and a strong presence in the constitution negotiations. And the Shia Islamists, who essentially ran on a unity ticket under instructions from Ayatollah Sistani in Najaf, they had by far the largest delegation. The Sunni delegation was minimal, and in fact, one of the things the Americans had to do, what we did after this lopsided election, was to push really hard on the Shia Islamists in particular, but also the Kurds, to allow for a more serious Sunni Arab presence in those constitution negotiations, to get, for example, elements of the Muslim Brotherhood as well as secular Iraqi Sunni Arab political figures in those talks. And I have to say the Shia Islamists and the Kurds were initially quite resistant and essentially said, well, if the Sunni Arabs boycotted, they're clearly still supporters of Saddam Hussein and they get what they deserve. And it took a lot of effort, a lot of jawboning to get them to back down. I think it helped a bit that we had troops in the country and they understood that we were not trying to set up a situation where Sunni Arabs could undertake some kind of a coup d'etat and reestablish a Ba'athi government in Iraq. But it was a hard negotiation that we were involved in March, April, and May, say, 2005, as they set that up. We didn't set quotas or anything like that, but we said it has to be a serious representation on that Constitution Committee. Once we got into discussing actual issues, first from a process standpoint, the U.S. Embassy's political office. We had a couple of Arabic speakers. We had one young American diplomat who was quite fluent in Arabic. And I was also present. I speak Arabic. We watched them discuss, and occasionally when tempers flared, we might suggest a recess, or maybe we'd stand up and quietly pass a note to someone and say, basically, don't overreact, or, you know, stay calm, or if you want to take a break, we'll support that idea. But we actually didn't make too many substantive suggestions in terms of text. Federalism was the first, but by no means the only issue that divided them. With respect to federalism in particular, we did not have good examples in the region. As I said, the ethos of Arab nationalism from Morocco and Algeria in Northwest Africa all the way to Saudi Arabia and Oman in the eastern part of the Arab world is for heavy-duty centralized national government. And so the examples that we gave them were for places like Germany and Switzerland, which probably were not, I think, most Iraqis just looked at European experiences or even the American experience and just said, well, we're Iraqis. We invented writing. We have a culture that goes back 4,000 years, and you really don't have anything to teach us about governance. Please get out of our way. But they quickly started to disagree amongst each other over the scope of authorities, where the Kurds and, to a lesser extent, the Shia Islamists wanted local governments, provincial level governments, to have more authority. And the Sunni Arab representation was urging a break on that process and to maintain the authorities of the central government. I would just quickly add a couple of things there. The position of the American government evolved such that we began also to promote the idea of federalism. We left our position of detachment, and the top, I emphasize this, the top American government officials, president, the American ambassador, supported giving local governments more authority. That even included issues such as oil revenues. I remember sitting in a conversation with the American ambassador at the time and warning that if the central government was robbed of its ability to use oil revenues, we would never have a strong central government able to field an army that could take over security responsibilities one day from the Americans so that we could get the American forces to withdraw. The central government in Iraq to this day is dependent on oil revenues, earnings from the export of petroleum for more than 90% of its revenues. And if you turn that over to local governments, then the central government will, because it lacks any resources, financial resources, it won't be able to field a strong army or do other things that central governments do. The American ambassador told me this while we were in the middle of these rather tense arguments in the fall of 2005. At one point, he slammed his fist down on the table inside the U.S. Embassy meeting room and glared at me and said, "You're one of these State Department Sunni Arab lovers." I said to him, I said, "We're trying to get a government that can take over security responsibilities." I said, "That's what we're trying to do. It's not about which faction we're backing." I didn't win that argument. So we've had, I mean, especially in the last 15 years, there have been constant arguments to this day, to July 2024, about the scope of authority of the central government with respect to oil revenues versus that of provinces or the Kurdish region. And over time, the central government has asserted more authority, but they've done so literally with guns. That's often supplied by who else? Iran. And so I think our role there probably was not as helpful as it could have been. I think a little more clarity at the front. Instead of letting the Kurds write this section with Shia Islamist support to an extent, I think if we had urged a little more caution, that would have been useful.
Rob, in your sense, does the U.S. government, State Department, or whomever they're tapping, have this type of capacity to help countries that are transitioning from conflict understand electoral processes, understand constitutional processes, asymmetrical federalism? Is this, you can't really bring in the copy of the U.S. Constitution and say, hey, look how we did it 200 years ago. Here you go.
Yeah, right. Which
And
one of you is Hamilton here? Which
who
one of
wants
you
to
is Madison?
and can you sing and dance?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So what I would say, Paul, is I always found the political people to be very sharp, very, very sharp. But they had, unlike the American embassy, which was thinking long term because we lived in a protected compound and we had protection from the US military, and Iraqi politicians were thinking like, how am I going to be safe in 2 or 3 or 4 years? And how is my family going to be safe? And how is my political party going to be safe? And then when I say safe, I mean both physically safe, but also strong in a political sense, access to resources and ability to operate, etc., and maybe have an advantage politically, security over my political competition. I I found quickly that appealing to national interest didn't get us very far. Iraqi politicians, and I think part of this was because of the security situation, had a remarkably short-term perspective on their interests. Like, how is this going to help me this week, this month? Not where are we going to be in 3 or 4 years? That was a much, much harder sell. And so we often had to say, if you're not so worried about it 2 or 3 years from now, is it going to aggravate tensions in, say, between the Kurdish provinces and the Shia provinces when you start arguing about, for example, control of oil fields along the lines between Shia-dominated provinces and Kurdish-dominated provinces, Kirkuk, for example, or Diyala, for example. And that they would sort of say, okay, I got to think about that. But you couldn't appeal just to national interest because they didn't have the same perspective of Iraqi national interests that we were at least trying to present.
So let's follow that into your work from 2005 into 2010. They had elections. They drafted a constitution. They did a do-over in 2007 to fix some of the elements of it. But you were heavily involved in helping to maintain the coalition, the government coalition, keeping it together. Once they formed the coalition, one of your roles was in, well, essentially helping them to adequately function as a new government of Iraq. Tell us a little bit about that and some of the strategies you employed.
In the immediate aftermath of the January 2005 elections and this very lopsided result, I believe in the 300 member parliament, there were only about 11 Sunni Arabs elected. And the share of population of the Sunni Arabs was, well, it's a subject of some dispute, but if we say 27 to 30%, we're in the ballpark in the absence of a census. But they only had in a 300 member parliament, they only had about 11 parliamentarians. In the absence of a constitution, the Paul Bremer run Coalition Provisional Authority, which was set up in 2003 in the immediate aftermath of the American invasion, where the Americans administered Iraq without any Iraqi input or with very little. They had written a transition administrative law, the TAL. You can find it on the internet. You can read it. It's kind of like a proto-constitution. And in it, it provided for how the Iraqis would then assemble a government after this January 2005 election. Because remember, they still didn't have a permanent constitution yet. That had to be negotiated, drafted, and ratified. So they were using this transition administrative law, which was largely a creation of American lawyers. And that required that a majority in the parliament back the new government. And it quickly became obvious that there would have to be a coalition because no single group had by itself a sole majority. And very naturally, the people who had opposed Saddam Hussein, Kurds and Shia Islamists, quickly aligned. and they had a majority, but they were perfectly prepared to rule Iraq with no Iraqi Sunni Arab participation whatsoever. That seemed exceptionally problematic from our point of view, especially because the people shooting at the American soldiers and Iraqis, for that matter, were largely Sunni Arabs. And this looked like it was going to exclude them entirely from the government. So very quickly, the American ambassador, who at this time was Sami Khalilzad, who is himself a very shrewd negotiator, I must say, Zal jumped into action with us, and we intensely, and I emphasize this word, intensely lobbied the leaders of the Shia Islamist grouping. There were multiple people who had influence. We were in with them all the time, as well as Kurdish leaders, Masoud Barzani and Jalal Talabani, intensely urging them to bring in at least some Sunni Arab figures into the new cabinet. We didn't give them quotas, we didn't give them numbers, but we said you cannot exclude them entirely. And we got into this very Iraqi, this kind of negotiation where they'd say, well, how about two? And the cabinet had about maybe 24 members of the cabinet would say two. That seems kind of low. What do you think? Are you talking to the Sunni Arabs? Well, of course, they didn't talk to the Sunni Arabs. They would only talk to each other, Kurds and Shia. There was no political communication really with the Sunni Arabs, and the Americans were constantly therefore shuttling messages back and forth. What about if they offer you this cabinet portfolio, higher education? Would that satisfy the demands of your community? No, we must have more. We must have. This went on, Paul, literally for months. And anytime we would say, why don't you just invite this prominent Sunni political figure over for tea in your office or at your home? They'd say, oh, we can't do that. Several times we tried to do that, where the ambassador, he had a residence with staff, and he would invite people over for lunch or dinner and try to get them to mix socially and maybe break the ice a little bit. Nothing doing. I can remember going to these dinners, and the Shia would just talk to the Shia, and the Kurds would just talk to the Kurds, and the Sunni Arabs would just talk to the Sunni Arabs. And as soon as we left, they would immediately leave, break off the conversation, and go back to their home group, Shia or Kurdish or Sunni. The distrust level, remember, there's a civil war going on. The distrust level was absolutely enormous. So finally, after more than a few serious, really knockdown conversations between the American embassy and the Iraqi political figures, I know at times we had to have President Bush or then Secretary of State Colin Powell intervene with letters or with phone calls. We finally got them to admit, I think they had about 4 Sunni Arab political figures in the government. I remember that the defense minister was someone who had no experience whatsoever in managing the military and was very much a token figure, but it at least gave the Sunni Arabs some, they could say, well, we got one important job, we got defense minister. So not that he had any real authority, but added, I guess, a bit of legitimacy. Throughout this period of this transition government, whose prime minister was Ibrahim Jaafri, the sectarian killing escalated and escalated, and the government was just completely incapable of addressing it. The Sunni Arabs in the government would not go to the prime minister and say, you've got to, there are people getting killed over here. We got to send more security over there. They would come to us and say, can you please get the prime minister to act? We'd say, well, have you talked to him? Like, well, we can't talk to the prime minister. I'm like, for heaven's sakes, you're in the cabinet. I mean, of course you can go talk to him. And we played an indispensable role. If some people might say, oh, you were enabling bad behavior, and I would not disagree with that, except that people were getting killed every day, and it was urgent to get action. And that was a really hard thing to do, especially with the prime minister at the time.
Robert, now over time, the last 15 years, how has that coalition building and interaction evolved? Is there more collaboration between the Sunni, the Shia, and the Kurds, or it's still a tripartite approach to governance?
I left my job at the embassy finally in 2010 and then followed events from Iraq, but from a distance, and I still do today. It seems that, especially in the wake of the fighting against ISIS, where the Americans had to resend soldiers back to Iraq after they had once been withdrawn, there was a level of stability. After that bitter fighting in 2015, 16, 17, the city of Mosul almost leveled in large parts of the city, ferocious fighting, and uh, literally millions of Sunni Arabs displaced from their homes in that fighting against ISIS. The Sunni Arab community politically has been just shattered. And there are now figures that have risen from that shattered community politically, but they no longer challenge Kurdish and Shia Islamist politicians the way they did in, say, 2005, 2006, 2007. They have decided that they will attract more flies with honey than vinegar, and so they work more easily. I wouldn't say happily, but they work more easily with Shia and Kurdish elements, political elements. Um, but the domination of the Shia Islamists over the political scene in Baghdad is now much firmer than it was, say, in 2005 and 2006.
Well, Robert, let me ask you for a takeaway lesson. Given the political landscape, it doesn't seem that the Americans will be running transitional authorities in any time in the near future. But in places like Yemen, in places like Sudan, even a little bit conversation South Sudan, still with Libya, there may be United Nations or international coalitions of the willing, for lack of a better term, that come in and provide the political infrastructure in the short term or the interim for a country to transition out of conflict and into a stable situation. What lessons do you want our listeners who may be involved in some of those democratic support missions to take away from your experience in Iraq?
I think the number one lesson in terms of political transition from Iraq, the number one lesson is don't rush to elections. Focus on getting the security right and focus on building a political climate, which may be very new in terms of people being able to speak and criticize openly and without retaliation. Newspapers, not only to start, we had lots of newspapers that started, but to be serious about the reporting. Iraqi press was quite irresponsible in 2005 and 6, would publish anything without checking it and probably with bad intent in many cases. So working on the political climate and the political culture. Of course, that takes a long time. You don't change a political culture in a week or a month or a year or 2 years, which is why I say I don't think you should rush to elections in general. But certainly when you do them, you need to have broad consensus about the process and about the timing. Timing is a big part of the process, but also about security. But if you cannot get security right, I want to emphasize this. If you cannot get security right, you cannot really hold an election that's going to be free and fair. If large segments of the population are too intimidated to vote, and they'll tell you if they are, they certainly told us in Iraq, and when people are afraid, they'll reach out to people they think might be able to help. So whether it's they'll talk to the United Nations or they'll talk to the peacekeeping force or they'll talk to the dominant military force if it's foreign to say, wait, stop, this isn't working. There will be people who will come forward, whether it be in Gaza or whether it be in Iraq or whether it be in Syria. So listen to them. One of the biggest problems the Americans had in this period, 2005, 6, was we had a timeline set out by this American drafted transition administrative law, and the president of the United States would not deviate from that timeline. And it was a real problem as Iraqis were themselves learning how to negotiate with each other. And then we had constantly had deadlines, and there's the American embassy operating under instructions from the Oval Office. You got to get this finished. You got to get this finished. And sometimes it takes a while to get to an agreement. And the Iraqis actually proved, especially by 2006 2007, 2008, that they could get to agreement, but they didn't operate on a timeline the way the Americans did.
So you need to give the democratic forces the time to.
Precisely. Don't rush them. I mean, keep them focused on the issues at hand, but don't rush them.
No, I think that advice is going to come in very handy in places like Sudan and Yemen and other places where the internationals may be involved in helping to facilitate.
Well, or Gaza, for example. So what I would just say is, with respect to Gaza right now, and there are some transition plans, including one prepared under the auspices of the Atlantic Council and others, but they are ignoring some of the key lessons of Iraq and plunging forward with Israeli approval on things that would essentially favor a certain element of Gaza society to manage a political transition. It's very little involvement of other Gazan voices. And there's a timeline again that is being set not according to what Gazans are recommending, but according to what planners in Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and Washington think is the best. And I fear that that is simply going to create more problems down the road.
Thank you for listening to this episode of our two-part interview with Ambassador Robert Ford. Join us as we continue this fascinating conversation in episode 2, where we discuss Ambassador Ford's time as U.S. Ambassador to Syria and his insights into leading the U.S. efforts to support Syria's peace process. We'll see you there.